It's been sheer hell. It's been such a tremendous thing that we just can't hardly imagine what we've been through. We look back and we don't believe what we've seen and what we've had to do, the bodies we've recovered. It's been a terrible experience for everybody involved. It's been long, hard hours, trying hours, and our people are tired. They've worked hard.
Sheer hell, perhaps the most accurate description of Rapid City, South Dakota, in the aftermath of what state officials call the worst disaster in South Dakota history. The death toll approaches 200, the number of missing in the hundreds. Thousands are homeless, the damage in the multi-millions of dollars. It was late Saturday evening when rain began to fall on the east slopes of South Dakota's Black Hills. By 9 p.m., the rain reached torrential stage, causing flash flooding from Keystone, South Dakota, near Mount Rushmore to Rapid City. The first flooding, reported at 10:30 p.m., was north of Rapid City on Rapid Creek, which winds through the city. Its waters quickly drained into Canyon Lake on the western edge of town, causing that lake's small earthen dam to collapse, sending swirling waters up to 5 feet through a heavy populated area down through the business district. The scene was one of chaos and confusion as people, homes, cars, highways, and bridges were swept away. Some escaped with their lives, but all they owned was lost. Mrs. Herman Fiddler and other Canyon Lake residents describe what happened to their home.
It's demolished. A house hit it. It was standing, my husband said, when the last time he saw it. We went to higher ground, and he said the last time he saw it, it was standing. Then a neighbor's house floated by, and he saw it bounce back, and he knew that it hit our house, and our house went.
Pretty soon I heard a kind of a rumbling noise, and I got up to look in our whole backyard, and everything was full of water, and by the time I got to the bedroom to get my coat and purse and glasses, why, it was up to my hips. We got out on the front porch, and we couldn't get the door open. So then we stood on a kind of a ledge on the porch for, it must have been an hour and a half. And we hollered for help, and there was a guy across the street had a boat. And they managed to get that boat over there, and then the whole thing, I'd say, was about 2 hours, maybe 2.5, where we were stranded in the water in the boat.
We just went to bed. We didn't think it was going to be that bad, so we went to bed. When we woke up, the trailer was moving. Travel trailer. And that's about it.
And your house?
Well, I don't know. I ain't found it yet. I ain't found my truck either.
What are you going to do now?
I don't know.
We were in our home.
Did you have advance warning?
About 10 minutes.
Any problem getting out?
No.
What was the water doing at the time?
Well, it was about 3 feet high right after we left. There was a woman in the trailer next to ours, and we talked to her this morning, and she said that she got out right after we did, and it was knee deep.
How did the flood affect you?
We've lost everything that we've ever owned in our lives. So I guess we'll have to start all over again.
You'll stay in Rapid City?
We don't know.
I'm not real sure yet.
Will your insurance cover your loss?
Well, that we don't know yet either. We won't find out till Monday morning.
The first bank of flood waters causing heavy surface damage broke gas and power lines, causing fires which blazed out of control as the waters covered 20% of the city. Power and telephone communications were knocked out throughout the night, much of which has still not been restored. With so many killed, first reports indicated the flood came without warning. But Rapid City Mayor Don Barnett says emergency radio and TV news of the flooding was broadcast at 9 and 10 p.m. yesterday. Many residents, said Barnett, failed to respond, even to personal appeals to leave their homes.
Most citizens, however, did not have their televisions on or their radios on. It was a very quiet, pleasant summer evening, and so consequently we weren't able to have much advance warning. This was quite a tragedy because even when we went to the doors of citizens with our policemen, our firemen, begging people to leave their homes, they discounted the seriousness of the issue, and they sometimes refused to move away from their property. Unfortunately, this has worked to the disadvantage of the entire city, and especially those people who have died as a result of the flood.
The flash flooding lasted some 5 hours, and by daybreak today, the waters, which approached as high as 10 feet in some areas, began to recede. The rains had stopped. The clouds broke, emitting sunshine over the stricken community. During the darkness, efforts had long been underway to rescue the homeless, treat the injured, and recover the dead. Most of the flood refugees and injured were taken to St. John McNamara Hospital and nearby Ellsworth Air Force Base. They, too, absorbed hundreds of patients who were forced to evacuate Bennett Clarkson Hospital on the western edge of Rapid City. It suffered extensive water damage. Emergency power allowed the hospitals to operate normally, and attention focused on immunization for typhoid and the problems of water contamination. Volunteers joined hospital staff in an efficient program of emergency medical attention. Most worked for 24 hours without sleep amid chaotic conditions. St. John McNamara Hospital's administrator, Sister Saharto Rogers, describes the situation.
We have been able to very adequately take care of all patients who have arrived. We've been able to handle a number of additional admissions. We've satisfactorily set up an emergency station where we have 40 additional beds in our School of Nursing. We've had excellent coverage of physicians. Our staffing has been fine all over the institution. We now have adequate electrical power. The water supply is adequate now that Ellsworth Air Force Base has provided us with tanks of sterile water. And our medical supply, this is very good.
Sister, how many flood victims have been treated at your hospital, and how many have been evacuated from the other hospital in the other areas?
Okay, I'd say approximately 150 patients have come through our triage area and have had some type of treatment. Now, of that 150, we've probably admitted about 30 of the disaster victims. Then early this morning, it was also determined that the other institution in town, Bennett Clarkson, could no longer function because of a loss of power. And we made arrangements that we could handle from 20 to 30 of their patients. The rest would go to Ellsworth Air Force Base, or the Rapid City Rehabilitation Hospital also took a number of them. So we've had 27 of their patients transferred over.
Sister, from your observations, what has been the reaction of the flood victims themselves?
Oh, it's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. It's like it's so horribly unreal. The shock and the trauma and the it's too difficult to even say.
And what is your own personal reaction?
I'm very grateful that we've had a good disaster program, because even though we haven't been able to implement the majority of our plan, at least we had a frame of reference to start from, so that it's been very easy to be flexible about our planning all over the house with all of our people. So I'm awfully glad we had that to start from.
As the community joined together to make the tragedy and hardships a little bit easier, help was also coming from the outside. President Nixon has declared the region a federal disaster area and ordered his chief aide for disaster relief to make sure all assistance is expedited. A spokesman for the president said Nixon has been following news reports of the disaster closely and is deeply disturbed at the loss of life and destruction in Rapid City. Senator George McGovern arrived in Rapid City this morning. South Dakota Governor Richard Knight toured the area Saturday and met this morning with legislative leaders to discuss state help for the community. Iowa Governor Bob Ray has offered use of the Iowa National Guard on a voluntary basis to aid flood-stricken residents. And North Dakota Governor William Guy has also offered his assistance. Medical help came from throughout the area. Nurses, doctors, and just plain people volunteering their time to aid a desperate community. Contributions of food and clothing were pouring in to be placed in the town's 3 refugee centers, which provided a place for homeless Rapid City families in the wake of the disaster. A truckload of clothing and bedding came from Chadron, Nebraska, accompanied by members of the special deputies from Chadron. The Salvation Army spearheaded the feeding of homeless and those working in the search for more victims. Mayor Don Barnett praised the efforts of local residents.
Rapid City citizens are very humble, and they're very simple people, and they don't expect too much from each other. But when it comes a time to be a good friend to a neighbor, you'll find the citizens of Rapid City are very strong and compassionate with each other. Since this disaster has started, the citizens of Rapid City have come forth with dozens of charitable examples in good citizenship and good friendship to each other. We have now various areas throughout the city where we were taking care of these refugees with good housing now and good food and good services to show that good neighborliness is really a fact of life in Rapid City.
Well, I think the people of Rapid City should be commended, really. The way they volunteered and turned out without any, reservations whatsoever. But it's the flood victims themselves that have been so tremendous. Their attitude, their outlook. At least they came out with their life, how lucky they are. And, there have been just hundreds of teenagers that have turned out today. Just don't sell those teenagers short. They have been just great.
Do you think Rapid City will ever be able to recover from this flood?
I think so. There was one a few years ago, not anywhere near like this. But these people are pretty versatile, and they'll swing back.
We're up here to assist the people in any way that we can. We brought food and water up with us to help the people.
And you're here as long as needed?
Right.
And tell me a little bit about your group, and does it usually perform at disasters such as this?
Well, whenever we're needed. We're a volunteer organization in Chadron, Nebraska. We assist at any time we want. Anybody that needs us anytime.
We're distributing clothing, and we're more or less the clearinghouse for persons in need of clothing, blankets, and foodstuffs. We're serving hot meals all the time, and we're giving groceries to persons who have taken other families into their own home. Their own home was not hurt with this disaster, and they've taken other families into their own homes. We're helping out there also.
Rescue efforts were many in Rapid City, and some were tragic, resulting in loss of life for volunteers going to the aid of their fellow man. A Salvation Army major out to survey the area to determine the extent of help needed failed to return home. His wife, manning the aid station in the city auditorium, worked throughout the day, uncertain whether her husband was dead or alive. He was one of the victims identified late Saturday in one of the temporary morgues. A firefighter drowned going to the aid of some children. 2 airmen also on a rescue mission perished. There was little that could be done in many instances, as was the case of Jordan C. Jordan in a rescue caravan heading for a nursing home when his car was swept away just after he jumped from the vehicle. Sir Jordan climbed aboard a fire truck and saw the body of a young man float by. He reached for the body, caught hold, and Sir Jordan was struck by a butane tank, and the youth was lost. A gasoline station owner at Keystone spent the night on his roof, helpless as he watched a man in a sleeping bag float by. A young military man walked the creek bank looking in the debris. Asked what he was searching for, he explained his nephew had been swept away out of reach of the rescuers the night before. On down the street, a large Army crane lifted a tree to remove the mangled body of a young boy, apparently the missing nephew. Rescue workers were more successful in other efforts, pulling the homeless from rooftops or stalled cars. Rescue workers came from all over. They included not only Rapid City residents who had remained safe during the disaster, but National Guardsmen, firefighters, law officials, civil defense workers, and nurses. A nurse identified only as Pam performed perhaps one of the most dangerous tasks. She allowed herself to be pulled across the rampaging Rapid Creek on ropes to rush serum to stranded residents. As volunteers lined the creek bank, Pam, whose regular job is at the Sturgis Hospital, carried the syringe clenched in her teeth as she held tightly to the pull ropes and made her way across, only inches above the fast-moving waters.
Well, I was up at Black Hawk. This is a small town approximately 10 miles from Rapid City, maybe less, I don't know. But myself and my brother and another gentleman that was in the National Guard did recover a gentleman that was stranded out in an isolated area. He was in shock, and there was another person with him that could not get out of this area. And we had to tie a rope around this one guy and send him across in the water. Then he grabbed the man that was in shock and injured, and we pulled him across and got him out of there. And we got out to the area earlier with flashlights and rescue equipment to try to save some people if we could. And the water was just near the bridge. And all of a sudden this avalanche of water came down from the hills, and we had to move our trucks back quite quickly, you know, and there were quite a few cars and stuff that were washed off the road. And then there was a trailer sailed across the road with very large trailers, 60-footers, and they washed clear across the road and blocked it, and then the bridge gave out up there.
There were
a couple friends of mine and I about 2:30 this morning who recovered this lady from a tree. She was brought in by boat, and then I took her and a father and his son to my home, and learned as we were traveling to my home that she thought she was the only surviving person of a group of 7, 5 in her family and 2 house guests. So as soon as we had her tucked in, I went out to see if I could find some of the kids, located 2 of them, and she was delighted to see these 2 come in safely, but we still have no idea where the youngest child is, and her husband is still missing. The 2 house guests were found on the roof of one of the stores in the area.
What has been the reaction, Paul, of these these people?
The people of Rapid City have responded wonderfully, generously in providing help and food and clothing. Just now we're taking shoes and underwear out to one of the schools for distribution to some of these flood victims.
What about the victims themselves? Their reaction, is it one of disbelief?
I think so, and they are dazed. This lady that I was speaking of, who is staying at my home, is just walking around in a daze. The young people seem to be a lot more flexible.
Not only Rapid City, but several outlying areas were victims of high waters. No traffic was allowed for a time west of Wall, some 50 miles east of Rapid City. Custer reported substantial property damage. Some homes were damaged in Sturgis. At Hermosa, as in several other areas, residents were temporarily on alert for possible flooding from another dam. At Keystone, 15 miles from Rapid City, residents were reportedly wandering around dazed, not knowing where to go after floodwaters virtually wiped out the gold mining town. 6 persons were known dead in Keystone. Authorities fear, with few reports from isolated communities, that the count of flood victims will continue upward. Campers have been isolated by washed-out roads, and there were an estimated 4,000 tourists in the Black Hills area when the high waters came. Pennington County Sheriff Glenn Bass talked about major problems in the area.
Our major problems, of course, are still the debris, the water that we have to contend with. We know many bodies in areas that will be hard to get to probably for several days yet. We don't have a lot of equipment that will travel in muck and mud and so forth, so we do have a real problem of getting to these areas that the bodies will be in.
Any estimate on the missing and the dead?
Our original estimate, sir, was about 500 of the missing. I think that maybe was a bit large. We now feel that the figure will be somewhat less than that. We have recovered something in the neighborhood of 150 bodies at this point.
As the grim search continues for the victims of Rapid City's worst disaster and the floodwaters recede, the residents of the usually quiet Black Hills community will continue to remember and possibly to fear. A rumored dam breaking will continue to bring possible panic, as occurred late Saturday when, after 24 hours of tragedy, the word spread of more water. Sirens sounded, motorists waved oncoming traffic back, and families shouted to each other to run. More water was coming. But fortunately, while the panic was real, the additional flooding was only rumor. Cars turned in the middle of the streets. Residents ran to the curb for rides to high ground. But the danger was only rumor. The other dam was holding tight. While tragedy was everywhere, the worst appeared to be over, and neighbors were helping neighbors. Even the youngest of the community were doing their part.
Oh, yes, I could. Tragedy and pathos apparently brings out very beautiful parts of everybody. And I think one of the most unique things today was a little bitty boy I met out in the on the sidewalk, and the little kid couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old. He was lugging a big packet of bedspread, and apparently it was filled with things. And I asked him what he wanted, and he said, well, he lived next door to someone that he knew was a patient here in the hospital, and he said, I got in and I got some kivers for him. So he said, I just want him to know that everything else is gone, but he's got some kivers left.
Troubled Waters, a report on the flood situation at Rapid City, South Dakota, represents some
24 hours of on-the-scene coverage by this reporter, my colleagues Jolene Stevens, Phil Vanos, and the head of our creative films department, George Lindblade. During the time that we were in the area, we saw more than we could present at this time. We hope to give you some view of the situation in Rapid City and the plight of the people. The worst appears to be over at this time. The main center of attention at this time is the recovery of the flood victims. The cleanup has begun. At this point, the latest count, 208 people killed. Hundreds are still missing. Thousands are homeless. The situation now is people helping people in Rapid City, and help, of course, is coming from out of town. We'll be talking about that in just a moment. Phil and Jolene, I'd like to ask you your reaction. What stirred your emotions?
Bob, I think probably one of the things that most impressed me was this little nurse that our viewers saw in the film, who, while on vacation, volunteered her services to make this, I would say, somewhat hazardous trip across the flooded creek to rush this serum. It took just plain guts, I think, for her to go over. Shortly after she went over, it does not show it in the film, but that tree that the ropes were tied to fell. And she fortunately got over. I think that that probably was the thing that impressed me, as well as the general overall togetherness of the flood victims.
Phil, what about yourself?
I think the most impressive part of the whole thing to me was, after being out there, was the panic scene that you saw along the highway when they thought that the dam was breaking. And we were on a regular two-way highway. The Air Force came by us, an Air Force truck, and screamed at us that the dam had broken, and to turn around and go back, which we did, and many other people with us. And as you saw, the people screaming at each other, coming out of the houses, jumping in the cars. Immediately that highway become a one-way traffic getting away from that the potential flood area. Had it broken, why it would have wiped out the town and everybody there.
You know, we've been up for some 48 hours. We got back from Rapid City early this morning. I don't believe my brain is functioning quite normally. I tried to think of something that stirred my emotions. One particular thing, there really wasn't. I think it was a culmination of many things that I saw. The volunteer effort, the young and old working together, the recovery operations. These things really stirred my emotions.
I think, Bob, one thing that, while we were covering one segment of this story that you mentioned, and I think it's very true, is this is probably one of the hardest types of stories to cover. You're intruding on someone's personal emotion when you see them in tragedy. And I think you'll say, too, the one woman that you interviewed, she was in tears as she told about losing her home. Our job is difficult to do, I think, at times like this. We feel a great deal of sympathy for these people and want to help. In fact, some of us, I think, would have liked to have stayed over as volunteers to help out how we could.
Oh, I would have loved to have stayed. I think it's a difficult story to cover for a reporter and for a photographer. You try to think of questions. What do you ask someone that has lost their home, their families? It's a very difficult situation. It was an unusual disaster in Rapid City. The area generally receives something like 14 inches, under 14 inches of rainfall during the year. It's a once-in-a-century thing when something like this happens, unusual weather conditions. It's the worst flood in America in 35 years. Back in 1937, some 250 died in flooding of the Ohio and Mississippi valleys. Let's talk just a moment about something that has really amazed me locally. I think we had something, maybe one or two announcements on earlier about the situation and whether or not people would like to donate clothing and so on. What's happened on this?
Bob, there are a lot of people here in the Sioux City area and surrounding territory that are turning out to collect clothing, things for these people. The Sac City Chamber of Commerce is sponsoring a drive with pickup points at the Army Reserve Center there, the Chamber Building and the Devil 66 station, all in Sac City. The Yankton Disabled American Veterans and VFW are collecting in Yankton. You may call 4108-3562 or 4253 for collection at your home in Yankton. At Ottawa, the West Monona JCs are asking goods to be dropped at the Ottawa Police Department. In Hinton, senior citizens are collecting for Rapid City. The pickup point there is the Hinton Community Hall. Here in Sioux City, the Morningside Kiwanis and commercial clubs are collecting items. They may be dropped off at 4022 Morningside Avenue. Or you can drop your clothing, checks, or whatever here at the Channel 9 studios at 7th and Douglas.
In light of the water contamination problem in Rapid City, and it is a problem, one of their big problems now, Sioux City Public Utilities Director Dick Wilford is offering any assistance he can to clear up the situation. He's made the offer of repair materials, chemicals, and advisors to clear up the water contamination problem. He says he's meeting with civil defense authorities tomorrow to see if any items are needed. So many people are turning out to help in the area, and I'm sure assistance will be coming from all over the nation. It's already started. In fact, here in our studios, we've got one area just jammed with clothing and materials people are donating. Some of the people that we met in Rapid City, Jolene, that were from out of town. What about Lieutenant John Stearns? He's with the Salvation Army in Hastings.
This gentleman provided us with transportation while we were in Rapid City. He turned his car over to us. He was busy on his own, but still he had time for us, and it turned out that he at one time, Bob, worked some of the Sioux City floods for the Salvation Army. So he's sort of a veteran flood worker back in the earlier days. The Salvation Army kept working. The major there in Rapid City lost his life in the disaster. A number of these people, civil defense volunteers, 3 business people who took time to see that we got where we wanted to go. There were lots of these people.
Well, there was the deputy sheriff from Chadron, Nebraska, Bus Hedberg. He brought, 8 or 10 deputies up, and they're available for disasters such as this. They offer their services free, and these people really turned out for this.
There was just a whole lot of togetherness, I think, from everyone.
I can't get over the lieutenant there for the Salvation Army. You know, I walked up to him. We had to have a ride, and I said, you know, do you have a car? Do you suppose we could use it for a little while? He reached in his pocket. He said, here's the keys. Take it.
And we used it for a while.
Oh, did we ever?
We sure did.
He said for an hour, and it was 6 hours later we came back.
Early in the flooding, the telephone service, of course, and the electric power were out. What's the situation on this now?
I think some service is still out. They're saying that, you know, I think still only emergency calls, Bob.
Right.
But it's improving as crews get out.
There's a great deal of concern in the Rapid City area about the big Pactola Dam above Rapid City. They're afraid it may rupture. Incidentally, this was the scene that you were talking about where the people were in panic. We were in the area, and people said the dam had burst, and we began running. So they're watching this situation closely. The worst is over, it appears, in Rapid City. Recovery operations are still underway. Cleanup is well underway in the area, and the people are needing all the volunteer assistance they can get. Don't call or perhaps don't try to even drive up into the area. Many of the roads are still washed out, and it is a confused situation. I hope we brought you just a bit of what we've seen in Rapid City and the tragedy there, a tragedy that reminds us that we should never take for granted the situation around us. It could happen at any time. It can happen in Sioux City. It can happen where you're living. Thank you very much for being with us tonight.